Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I thought I would finally run you through my Sentro knitting machine. I'm going to start with something really basic. What I'm going to do in today's video is just run you through all the features, and then I'll show you how to cast on and cast off, which are basically the very first things you need to know before beginning a project on your knitting machine. So if you've watched my unboxing video, you'll probably already know a little bit about this machine, but I'm just going to run you through the features. So this is the Sentro knitting machine. It has 48 pegs all the way around, so it is quite a large machine. This obviously is your cranking handle, the handle you use to crank and to create your rounds. We then have a row counter on this side, which basically counts your rows as you go. To reset it, all you do is press this black button and it'll go back to 0. We've then got a tension gauge on the front of your machine. This has basically 3 settings, so you've got fine weight yarn, medium weight yarn, and then a chunkier kind of yarn. Personally, I would never use a chunky yarn in this machine. It just doesn't work well. I've used up to an Aran weight yarn, and that's pretty much as chunky as I would go because this machine does not like chunky yarn at all. I prefer to use a DK weight yarn, which is an 8 ply yarn. I find that works best in this machine, and I also find the softer the yarn, the better it works as well. So just keep that in mind when choosing yarn for your project. We've then also got a little switch on the side here, which basically says or tells the machine whether you want to work in a tube or you want to work in a panel. Leave it on T for now. We're going to be working in the tubular option today. I'll run you guys through the panel knitting in another video because that's a story for another day. But for today, we're just going to leave it on T for tubular. Then at the top of the machine, you've got your yarn guide here, which basically feeds your yarn into the machine to make sure it all runs nice and smoothly. Other than that, I think that's pretty much all the features. It does also have some suction caps on the feet of the machine, and that just kind of stabilizes your machine while you're cranking and makes sure it's not going to move around too much. So I do recommend using your knitting machine on a flat surface, something that your suction caps are going to stick to. If you're using it on carpet or something like that, that's fine, it will work, but you're gonna find that you're gonna need to be holding your machine while you're cranking, and it just becomes a little bit more complicated because it's gonna be moving around all over the place. But anyway, I do recommend using a nice flat solid surface to use your knitting machine on. A kitchen table works perfectly. Okay, now I'm going to show you guys how to cast on. Obviously, this is the very first step that you need to learn before beginning any projects on your knitting machine. So I'm using, as I mentioned, an 8 ply yarn. This is 100% acrylic. It's fairly soft. It is the Marvel 8 ply yarn from Spotlight if you're in Australia, but if you're not in Australia or you don't have access to Spotlight, you could use any 8 ply acrylic yarn. But as I mentioned, I do recommend using a softer type of yarn, and I recommend using an 8 ply because it just runs better in the machine. I don't know what it is, and I don't know if it's every knitting machine or if it's just this one, but this one seems to be a bit temperamental with chunkier yarns and anything bigger than an 8 ply. So to get started, first of all, we want to crank our handle until we find our white peg. Now, the white peg basically notifies you of when you're at the end of your round. So this will be peg number 48. If you look closely around the edges here, you'll see that all the pegs are numbered. So the white peg is number 48, and then we've got number 1 right next to it. So we're going to crank until number 1 is just at the front of our yarn guide. We're then going to take our yarn. I recommend unraveling a little bit first, just so it can flow nice and easily and it doesn't get caught up. I'm going to pop that into the middle there, and then we're going to put our working yarn back into the middle. And we want to make sure that the end of our yarn is on the right-hand side of our machine. So in our left hand, we'll be holding our working yarn, and then on this side will be the end. Okay, so what we're going to do first of all is thread this working yarn in under peg number 1. So you'll see that that's in there, nice and secure. Leave a little bit of an end. I recommend maybe about 10 inches or so, just to be safe. And we're then going to crank very, very slowly, and we're going to be working in a zigzag manner. So this first one went in under the peg, and now in the second peg, we're going around behind it. So we're basically zigzagging in and out of our pegs, just like this. So behind, under, behind, under, behind, under, behind, under, so on and so forth until we get all the way back around to our white peg. Now don't rush this step, take it really slowly because you don't want to skip any pegs. And if you do skip anything, it's going to screw up your whole project basically because you're going to be dropping stitches everywhere. So just take it nice and slowly for this first round. Under, behind, under, behind, under, behind, under, behind, all the way around, and we're now back to our white peg. So we know we've cast it on all the way around because we're now back to our white peg. So continue cranking until the white peg's just past your yarn guide. We're now going to thread our yarn through our yarn guide just like that. We can now bring our yarn out of the middle. Just making sure you leave your end in the middle there. Bring the rest out, and we've threaded through our yarn guide, and we now need to go through our tension guide. So as you'll be able to see on your machine, there is 3 different holes. I recommend going through the middle hole if you are using an 8-ply yarn. If you're using something finer, obviously go through the smaller hole, and if you're using something chunkier, go through the bigger hole. But for 8-ply yarn, I always just use the middle hole, and that seems to work totally fine. Now before we start cranking, I do recommend pulling some yarn from your skein and making sure it's all nice and loose, because we don't want the weight of the skein weighing down on your tension guide, your tension gauge, guide, whatever you want to call it, because that can cause you to drop stitches if this ends up being too tight. So we want to make sure that we've always got free-flowing yarn out of our skein. So once all this is used up and you notice you're getting to the end, just pull some more out of your skein because it's going to help this to flow really, really nicely and avoid dropping any stitches. Okay, so now we've pulled quite a bit of yarn out of our skein, we're going to continue cranking. For the first couple of rounds, I do recommend going super slow because you don't want to drop any stitches. Because we've just cast on, and the cast on round isn't really a round, I wouldn't say. We want to just make sure we're going super slow to make sure that we don't drop any stitches, because the cast on round is kind of loose, so it would be super easy for it to just pop off the peg. So just going super duper slow all the way around. Using your hand to feed your yarn through so it's flowing nice and slowly and nice and smoothly. And this is basically what we're going to do all the way around. You'll notice that every time you get back to your white peg, your row counter will go up a number, and that just indicates that you've finished another round. I didn't reset this at the start, whoopsie, but usually after you cast on, you would reset this, make it go back to 0, so you can then keep count of your rows. So after the cast on round, as I said, that's not really classed as a round or a row. After you've casted on, I would then reset this and then start your row count. But for now, I'm just doing a practice, so I'm not really too worried about counting my rows. So I'm just going to go ahead now and crank maybe 20 or so rounds, and then I'll meet you back here and I'll show you guys how to cast off. Alrighty, so we're now back to our white peg. So that is now 20 rounds that we've done. So you'll see that it is coming along quite nicely. Now it might look like it's a bit holy, don't stress. Once you take it off and it's not stretched out like that, it will condense a lot. But I'm now going to show you how to cast off. So the way you will cast off will completely depend on what you're making, but I'm just going to show you probably the most common way, I would say, to cast off, and the safest way to avoid you dropping any stitches, because dropping stitches is a nightmare. We've all been there. Anyway, so basically to cast off, you're going to need a needle. This one just came with my knitting machine, so I'm just going to use that. It's just a plastic darning needle and some scissors. So basically you want to take your yarn, your working yarn, and you want to measure out, I reckon, about 2 lengths, I guess, going around, just to be safe, just to make sure you've got enough. So I usually measure, approximately enough yarn to go around this twice. So once you've done that, just cut your yarn. So your skein is now not attached to your project. And we're then going to take our needle and thread that. Just like so. And now for the tedious job of casting off. So first of all, we want to remove our yarn from our tension gauge. Like that, and we now want to remove it from our yarn guide by ensuring that your yarn is still hooked in under our white peg. Okay, so pop all that yarn in the middle of your machine, and now we're going to crank very, very slowly. Okay, so we're going to do 1 full round just like this. Very slowly, all the way until we get back to our white peg. Okay, so you can see now this is our white peg, so keep going until your peg is just to the right of your yarn guide, and you'll see that this stitch here has now popped off. So what we now want to do is go in with our needle in under that stitch. Just like that. So that stitch is now on our yarn. We've just gone through that stitch with our needle, basically. So that's what we're going to do for every stitch now going around. It is a little bit of a tedious job, but it is the safest way to ensure that you don't drop any stitches. Next one. So you don't need to keep cranking all the way around. It's probably easiest if you just pick them up as they're on the peg, and that's going to ensure that you don't drop any either. So we're just going in under every stitch all the way around and securing that stitch by going through it with our needle and ensuring that it's not going to drop. We're not going to lose it, because these are all live stitches, so if you drop one, chances are you're going to have a big hole in your work. This is the way you would cast off if you were making something like a beanie, say, that you wanted to have cinched at the top, because as you'll see once I've finished doing this, you'll be able to pull this yarn and cinch it at the top. Perfect for beanie making. Also be really gentle when you're doing this, because if you start pulling stitches off like crazy, you're going to end up pulling just like that. See how that stitch popped off and I haven't secured it yet, so I now need to go in and re-secure that stitch. Oh, and I've lost that one as well. So this is what I'm saying, guys, you have to be really careful when taking these off. Don't worry about pulling tight for now. Just ensure, like, the most important part at the moment is just ensuring that every stitch is secured so it's not going to unravel. And we can tighten it up at the end. Almost there. Alright, so we've now just secured the stitch that was on our white peg, which means we have now secured every stitch. So you can go ahead now and pull your work off your machine. Should be fairly easy. Just like so. We can now get rid of our machine. Obviously, if you were making something, you would probably make a tube much longer than this, but just for this example, I've just done about 20 rows. You'll want to stretch it out so all the stitches go nice and condensed. So this is basically what you're left with. Now, depending on what you are making will depend on how you finish off your project, so don't stress too much about these scrappy ends, because usually they would be sewn together or hidden with a pom-pom or something if you're making a hat. But basically now what you would do is go ahead and either, if you were making something that was flat, so say a headband or something, you would sew these edges together. So cinch them like that, or turn it inside out even, and sew along that edge to tidy it up. Or if you were making a beanie or a hat and you did want to cinch the top together, all you would do would be to take that yarn that we just used to pick up all our stitches and secure our stitches, give that a pull, and you'll see that that now cinches that at the top. So I would probably push that in so it goes on the inside and you don't see it on the outside. Give it a little pull, and now you'll see it's nice and neatly cinched at the top. So that's basically how you would make a beanie. But for now, keep practicing, perfect those techniques first, and then you can commit to making something on your knitting machine. I am still quite the beginner at the knitting machine as well, so bear with me with these videos. I'm kind of learning along the way, but my knitting machine has been an absolute godsend. I have used this for all my markets. It's perfect for market prep if you want to just quickly crank out some scarves or some beanies or some headbands or things like that. You can make so many different things with these. There are thousands of videos on YouTube with different things that you can make using your knitting machine. I promise I will come out with some tutorial videos of my own really soon. If there is something that you would like to learn how to make in particular, please leave a comment down below and I will try my very best to help. But in the meantime, I hope you all have a great rest of your day and don't forget to stay safe, guys. Bye!